Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going on a deep dive into Nudge, the final edition.
Ah, yes, the updated classic by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein.
It's all about behavioral economics.
And how little things can have a big impact on the choices we make.
You know, it's funny because traditional economics often assumes that people are, perfectly rational.
Right, always making the best possible decision based on all the available information.
But in reality, we're not like that at all. We're all a bit irrational sometimes.
Absolutely. Thaler and Sunstein even have a name for these perfectly rational beings that traditional economics imagines.
What is it?
They call them econs. But in reality, we're more like humans, prone to biases and emotions and all sorts of quirks.
So are they saying that economics is basically wrong?
No, not necessarily. It's more like traditional economics provides a simplified model of human behavior.
Kind of like a starting point.
Exactly. But Nudge argues that we need to account for these real-world human tendencies if we want to understand how people actually make decisions.
I mean, I know I'm not always rational. I'm sure everyone listening has made a decision they later regretted.
It's part of being human. And the book is full of fascinating examples of these cognitive biases, these mental shortcuts that can sometimes lead us astray.
Yeah, like that thing where you're more afraid of flying than driving, even though statistically driving is much more dangerous.
That's a classic example of the availability heuristic. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall.
Right, because plane crashes are so vivid and memorable, they stick in our minds, even though they're incredibly rare.
Exactly. But it's not just about dramatic events like plane crashes. These biases influence our everyday choices in all sorts of ways.
Give me another example.
Well, have you ever bought something you didn't really need just because it was on sale?
Oh, all the time. Like, I don't even need another pair of shoes, but 50% off. How can I resist?
That's loss aversion in action. We hate losing out on a deal, even if it means spending money we didn't plan to. The pain of missing out can outweigh the benefit of saving money.
It's almost like our brains are wired to be irrational.
In a way, yes. Our brains have evolved to make quick decisions, often based on heuristics rather than deep, logical thought. And these heuristics were very helpful for our ancestors.
I guess when you're running from a saber-toothed tiger, you don't have time to weigh all the pros and cons.
Exactly. But in our modern world, these same heuristics can sometimes lead to less than optimal outcomes.
So what's the solution? Are we doomed to be slaves to our irrational impulses?
Not at all. That's where the concept of nudge comes in.
A nudge, like a gentle push in the right direction.
Exactly. It's about designing environments that make it easier for people to make choices that are in their best interest.
Without taking away their freedom to choose otherwise.
That's the key. Thaler and Sunstein call it libertarian paternalism.
Libertarian paternalism, that sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, but it makes sense when you think about it. It's about guiding people towards good choices while still respecting their freedom to choose.
So it's not about banning junk food or forcing people to save for retirement.
No. It's about making the healthier option, or the responsible option, the easier, more appealing choice.
Can you give me an example of a nudge?
Absolutely. Imagine a school cafeteria where they want to encourage kids to eat more fruit.
Okay.
Instead of hiding the fruit in some dark corner, they put it right at eye level, front and center, make it colorful and appealing.
So the kids are more likely to grab an apple instead of a cookie.
Exactly. They're still free to choose the cookie if they want it, but the nudge makes the healthier choice more tempting.
That's so clever. It's like you're subtly shaping the environment to influence behavior.
Exactly. And the book is full of examples of nudges like this being used in all sorts of contexts, from encouraging organ donation to reducing energy consumption. It really is amazing how these small changes can have such a big impact.
But how do we know if a nudge is ethical? Isn't there a risk of manipulation?
That's a great question, and it's something that Thaler and Sunstein address very carefully in the book. They argue that nudges should be transparent.
So people should be aware that they're being nudged.
Ideally, yes. And the nudge should be easy to avoid. If you really want that cookie, you can still reach for it, even if the apple is more prominent.
It's about making it easier to make the good choice, not impossible to make the bad choice.
Precisely. The book also stresses that nudges should be used for good, to help people make choices that are in their best interest, not to exploit them or trick them.
I guess it all comes down to intent.
Absolutely. Like any tool, nudges can be used for good or for ill. It's up to us to ensure that they're used responsibly and ethically.
Well said. This is fascinating stuff. I'm already starting to see the world differently, like noticing all these little nudges that are already in place.
That's the first step towards becoming more aware of the forces that shape our choices. And once we understand those forces, we can start to harness them for good.
I love that. But I have to ask, are nudges really enough to solve big, complex problems like climate change or poverty?
That's a big question, and one we'll definitely delve into more deeply. But for now, I think it's important to remember that nudges are just one tool in the toolbox.
It's not about nudges versus everything else.
Exactly. It's about using all the tools at our disposal, including education, regulation, and yes, even nudges, to create a world that's more just, more sustainable, and more fulfilling for everyone. Welcome back to our deep dive into nudge,
We've been talking about how these subtle nudges can shape our choices.
often in ways we don't even realize.
Exactly. So where do we go from here?
Well, in this part of our deep dive, I think it would be interesting to look at some specific areas where nudges can be particularly effective.
Oh, I like that. Let's get specific.
So one area that Thaler and Sunstein focus on is personal finance.
Oh, personal finance. Always a tricky subject.
Right. It's full of decisions that can have a huge impact on our lives.
And let's be honest, most of us aren't exactly financial experts.
Exactly. And that's where nudges can really make a difference. They can help us navigate these complex financial decisions.
So, like, what kind of nudges are we talking about here?
Well, for example, think about retirement savings.
Okay, retirement savings. Something I definitely should be thinking about more.
We all should, but it's easy to put it off. It feels so far away.
And there are so many other things to spend money on right now.
Exactly. So one really effective nudge in this area has been automatic enrollment in retirement plans.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that. Instead of having to actively sign up, you're automatically enrolled unless you opt out.
Precisely. And it's had a huge impact. Studies have shown that automatic enrollment dramatically increases participation rates in retirement plans.
It's amazing how powerful defaults can be.
Yeah.
It's like we just go with the flow.
Exactly. And in a way, it makes sense. It takes effort to opt out, so most people just stick with the default.
It's like that saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right. But there's a catch here. The default savings rate matters a lot.
Oh, right. If the default is too low, people might not be saving enough.
Exactly. So it's crucial to set the default rate at a level that encourages adequate savings.
That makes sense. But even with a good default rate, saving for retirement can feel overwhelming.
You're absolutely right. There's so much to think about. Asset allocation, risk tolerance, all that stuff.
And then there are all those different investment options.
Yeah.
Stocks, bonds, mutual funds. It's enough to make your head spin.
I know. It can be incredibly confusing, especially for people who aren't financial experts.
Which is most of us.
Right. So what can we do to make it easier for people to invest wisely?
Well, maybe there's a nudge for that too.
There is. Thaler and Sunstein talk about something called target date funds.
Target date funds. I've heard of those, but I don't really know what they are.
It's basically a type of mutual fund that automatically adjusts your asset allocation as you get closer to retirement.
Oh, so you don't have to worry about figuring out how much to invest in stocks versus bonds and all that.
Exactly. You just choose a fund with a target date that corresponds to your planned retirement year. Like, if you're planning to retire in 2045, you'd choose a 2045 target date fund.
And then the fund managers take care of everything else.
Yeah. They automatically adjust the mix of stocks and bonds in the portfolio to become more conservative as you approach retirement.
So it's like having a personal investment advisor on autopilot.
Exactly. It takes the guesswork out of investing, especially for people who don't have the time or expertise to manage their own portfolio.
That sounds amazing. I wish someone had told me about target date funds years ago.
Well, better late than never.
Yeah.
But, even with all these helpful nudges, there's still this dark side of choice architecture that we need to be aware of.
Oh, you mean sludge?
Exactly. Sludge is all that friction, all those unnecessary obstacles and hassles that make it harder to achieve our goals.
Ugh, yes, sludge. The bane of my existence. Like trying to unsubscribe from an email list that you never signed up for in the first place.
Oh, I feel your pain. It's like they make it intentionally difficult to unsubscribe.
And then there are those hidden fees and surcharges that you don't realize you're paying until it's too late.
Yes. Like those resort fees that hotels tack onto your bill, or those crazy baggage fees that airlines charge.
It's like they're trying to sneak in extra charges without you noticing.
Exactly. It's all part of this sludge-filled world we live in, and it's not just annoying. It can have real financial consequences.
Absolutely. All those little fees and extra charges can add up over time.
And they can make us less likely to make good choices. Like, If it's too much of a hassle to switch to a cheaper energy provider, we might just stick with the more expensive option.
It's like sludge is weighing us down, making it harder to move forward.
That's a great way to put it. But don't despair, there are ways to combat sludge. And one of the most important is awareness.
So the first step is to recognize the ways in which sludge is operating, like to be aware of those hidden fees and those tricky unsubscribe processes.
Exactly. Once we see the sludge for what it is, we can start to make more informed choices. We can choose companies that make things easy and transparent and avoid those that try to bury us in sludge.
It's like voting with our wallets, choosing to support businesses that respect our time and our money.
I love that. And we can also advocate for policies that promote transparency and simplicity, policies that make it easier for people to make good choices.
That's so important because let's face it, sometimes the sludge is so thick that it feels impossible to get through.
Absolutely. We need systemic changes to make the world a less sludge-filled place. But even in the meantime, being aware of sludge can help us make smarter decisions and protect ourselves from those unnecessary costs and hassles.
I'm all for that. So we've talked about retirement savings, investing, and the perils of sludge. What other areas of personal finance can nudges help us with?
Well, there's one that's often overlooked, but it's incredibly important: insurance.
Oh, yes, insurance. Another one of those topics that makes my head spin.
I think a lot of people feel that way. There's so many different types of insurance, and all those terms and conditions can be so confusing.
It's hard to know what kind of coverage you need and how much you should be paying.
Exactly, and that's where nudges can come in handy. They can help us make more informed decisions about insurance, especially when it comes to choosing deductibles.
Deductibles, those are always a mystery to me.
Oh, I know, right? But they're actually pretty simple once you understand them. A deductible is the amount of money you have to pay out of pocket before your insurance coverage kicks in.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if I have a $500 deductible on my car insurance and I get into an accident that causes $1,000 worth of damage, I have to pay the first $500 myself.
Exactly. And then your insurance company covers the remaining $500.
So the higher the deductible, the less I have to pay if something happens.
Well, not quite. The higher your deductible, the lower your monthly premiums will be.
Premiums.
Premiums are the regular payments you make to your insurance company, whether or not you file a claim.
Okay, got it. So it's kind of a trade-off. A higher deductible means lower monthly payments, but also more out-of-pocket expenses if you need to use your insurance.
Precisely. And the book argues that most people choose deductibles that are too low.
Really? Why is that a problem?
Well, it can end up costing you more money in the long run. If you have a low deductible, you're paying higher premiums every month, even if you rarely file a claim.
So it's like you're paying for peace of mind, but you might be better off financially if you chose a higher deductible.
Exactly. The book provides some helpful tips for choosing the right deductible based on your individual circumstances and risk tolerance.
It's about finding that balance between being adequately covered and not overpaying for insurance.
Exactly. The book also highlights the importance of framing when it comes to insurance.
Framing. How does that apply to insurance?
Well, think about how insurance is typically presented. It's often framed as a way to protect yourself from financial loss, to avoid those catastrophic expenses that could wipe out your savings.
Yeah, that's definitely how I've always thought about it.
Right. But the book suggests that we might be better off thinking about insurance as a form of investment.
Investment.
Yeah. It's a way to manage risk and potentially even earn a return over time.
I never thought about it that way.
But when you think about it, it makes sense. You're paying a small amount now to avoid a potentially much larger expense in the future.
It's like putting money into a savings account, but instead of earning interest, you're protecting yourself from financial disaster.
Exactly. And this shift in framing can lead to more rational and financially sound decisions about insurance coverage.
That's really interesting. I'm starting to see insurance in a whole new light.
I'm glad to hear that. I think one of the most important messages of Nudge is that understanding how our minds work, how we're influenced by biases and framing, can empower us to make better choices in all aspects of our lives, including our personal finances.
Absolutely. But before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier: organ donation.
Oh, yeah, let's dive back into that.
It's a topic that brings up a lot of ethical questions, especially regarding the concept of presumed consent.
Right, where everyone is considered an organ donor unless they specifically opt out.
Exactly. Some people think it's a great way to increase donation rates and save lives.
And it makes sense on the surface. If it's the default, people are more likely to go with it.
But others argue that it raises concerns about individual autonomy and the right to control what happens to your body.
It's a complex issue, for sure, and the book explores both sides of the argument very thoughtfully.
It's a reminder that nudging, while a powerful tool, should always be used ethically. We have to consider the potential consequences, both positive and negative.
Absolutely. There are always trade-offs to consider, and it's important to have these conversations and to think critically about how nudges are being used. Welcome back. We're nearing the end of our deep dive into Nudge, the final edition.
It's been a fascinating exploration of behavioral economics and the power of, well, nudges.
Absolutely. But as with any powerful tool, there are always questions about how it's used.
And who gets to use it?
Exactly. So in this final part, I think it's important to address some of the criticisms that have been leveled at nudging.
Okay, let's get into it. What are some of the main concerns people have raised?
Well, one of the most common is that nudging is manipulative.
I can see that. Like, if you're not careful, it could be used to trick people into making choices they wouldn't otherwise make.
Right. And that raises questions about individual autonomy and freedom of choice.
Like, who are we to decide what's best for other people?
Exactly. And those are valid concerns. But Thaler and Sunstein address this directly in the book.
What do they say?
Well, they emphasize that nudges should always preserve freedom of choice. It's about making it easier to make the good choice, not impossible to make the bad choice.
So it's not about taking away options.
Exactly. It's about designing the environment in a way that makes the desired behavior more likely.
I guess it's kind of like putting healthy snacks at eye level in a vending machine.
Exactly. You're not preventing people from choosing the chips or candy, but you're making the healthy choice more appealing and accessible.
Okay, I get it. But even if nudges aren't technically coercive, couldn't they still be seen as paternalistic?
That's a fair point. And it's something that Thaler and Sunstein grapple with in the book. They acknowledge that some degree of paternalism is inevitable.
How so?
Well, choice architecture is always present, whether we're aware of it or not. Someone is always making decisions about how choices are presented to us.
I guess that's true. Like the way products are arranged in a supermarket or the order of options on a ballot.
Exactly. And those choices can have a real impact on our behavior.
So even if we're not trying to nudge people, we're still influencing their choices in some way.
That's the point. And Thaler and Sunstein argue that if we're going to have a choice architecture, it might as well be one that's designed to help people make good choices.
That makes sense. But there's another criticism I've heard about nudging,
What's that?
that it's just a Band-Aid solution, that it focuses on changing behavior without addressing the underlying causes of problems.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, instead of nudging people to save more for retirement, maybe we should focus on fixing the systemic issues that make it so hard for people to save in the first place.
Right. Or instead of nudging people to eat healthier, maybe we should focus on making healthy food more affordable and accessible.
Those are all valid points. And I think it's important to remember that nudges are just one tool in the toolbox.
Not the whole solution.
Exactly. We need a multi-pronged approach that includes education, regulation, and social programs, in addition to nudges.
So it's about using all the tools at our disposal to create a better world.
Precisely. But even with all those other tools, I think nudges can still play a valuable role. They can help bridge the gap between what we know we should do and what we actually do.
Because sometimes, even when we know what's best for us, we still make choices that aren't in our best interest.
Exactly. Our emotions, our biases, our habits can get in the way. And that's where nudges can be helpful. They can make it easier to overcome those internal barriers and make the good choice the easy choice.
I guess it's kind of like having a little extra support to help us stay on track.
Exactly. But there's another argument against nudging that I want to address. And it's a slippery slope argument.
Oh, the slippery slope. Like if we start nudging people to eat healthy food, what's next? Nudging them to exercise or to read certain books. Where do we draw the line?
That's a valid concern, and it's something that we need to be mindful of. But I think it's important to remember that nudges, by definition, preserve freedom of choice.
You're still free to choose the burger over the salad, even if the salad is more prominently displayed.
Exactly. A nudge might make the healthy choice more appealing, but it doesn't force you to make that choice.
So it's more like a gentle suggestion than a mandate.
Exactly, and I think that's a crucial distinction. Nudges should be used to empower people to make better choices, not to control their behavior.
That makes sense. So at the end of the day, nudging is a powerful tool that can be used for good or for ill. It all comes down to how it's used and who's using it.
I couldn't agree more. And I think Nudge, the final edition, provides a valuable framework for thinking about these issues. It encourages us to be more aware of choice architecture, to consider the ethics of nudging, and to use this tool responsibly.
I think this deep dive into nudge has really changed the way I think about choices and decisions. It's made me realize that we're all being nudged all the time, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about these nudges, the better equipped we'll be to make choices that are truly in our best interest.
And to create a world that's a little bit better, a little bit easier to navigate, a little bit more conducive to human flourishing.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on.
To our listeners, I highly recommend checking out Nudge, the final edition, for yourselves. It's a thought-provoking and surprisingly entertaining read, and it might just change the way you think about the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration.